Dear learners, we shall be starting our discussion on a very important topic of sale of goods law, that is passing of property. So here, passing of property essentially refers to the transfer of property from the seller to the buyer. So at what time does the buyer acquire rights in the property, and at what time does he gets the ownership of the property is a subject matter that we shall be examining in this lecture. Now, passing is a word that may be used with various connotations. So, for example, there might be delivery of goods without ownership, there might be delivery of goods with ownership. But a more legally precise expression is transfer of property for that matter, which suggests a transfer of entire bundle of rights associated with the property. So passing of property, essentially a property in a transition phase from one party to another party. So we shall be taking up chapter 3 of the Sale of Goods Act, which lays down certain effects of contract or certain incidences of contract or legal consequences of contract. So broadly speaking, the legal consequences or effects of a contract can be divided into two heads. Firstly, transfer of property, and secondly, transfer of title. So transfer of property from section 18 to section 26, transfer of title from section 27 to section 30. So our discussion on transfer of property would be based upon transfer of property relating to specific goods from section 18 to 26. Then transfer of title we shall be taking up in another lecture later on. So looking at the introductory aspects of transfer of property, why is transfer of property important? This is because it forms the basis of a contract, or one of the reasons why the buyer especially enters into a contract. So the buyer makes a contract because he stands to gain something in terms of property in goods, whereas the seller gets a price in exchange for severing his connection with the property. So that is why transfer of property from the hands of seller to the buyer is an essential of a contract of sale under section 4. For a detailed discussion on the essentials of sale, kindly refer to our initial lectures on the sale of goods law. So the property here means general property and not any special property. So general property means entire bundle of rights that are associated with the property, like ownership. Special rights merely means right to use or right to have possession. Now you have to distinguish between delivery and transfer. So delivery may or may not be accompanied with ownership. So for example, if you are taking a car on rent and the owner of the car gives it to you on rent, so he has delivered his car, but he has not delivered the ownership rights on the car. So transfer is something that is more synonymous with ownership, and delivery may be with regard to ownership as well as possession. So transfer of property creates what is known as a rights in rem, meaning thereby rights against the entire world. So rights against everyone with regard to the property. So this is a kind of an absolute right which is effected through a transfer of property. So for this, transfer of property is very important in a contract of sale of goods. Now the rules of transfer They can be with regard to specific or ascertained goods and with regard to generic or unascertained goods. The legal framework related to specific or ascertained goods is contained from section 19 to 22 along with section 24, whereas for generic or unascertained goods from section 18 there is section 23 and section 25. So we already know what are specific goods and unspecific goods. Specific goods are those which have been identified and agreed upon at the time of making the contract of sale, while generic, unascertained or unspecific goods are those which have not been identified or agreed upon. Now we'll be first taking up section 19, which provides property passes when it is intended to pass. So goods, if they are specific goods, then the property is transferred when the parties intend it to be transferred. So here the law provides an emphasis on the will of the parties and does not make any intervention on its part, rather relegates it on the parties, but provides certain situations which have to be met. So intention of the parties, it can be gathered through multiple ways, like from the terms of the contract or from the conduct of the parties through their actions or through the circumstances of the case, which may vary according to the situation. Now we'll go to the next provision, that is specific goods in deliverable state. So while section 19 provides a general law relating to transfer of property in specific goods, leaving it to intention of the parties, section 20 covers a certain situation. Now according to section 20, where there is a unconditional contract for the sale of specific goods, the specific good shall be in a deliverable state. Now what is a deliverable state? Meaning thereby they are a kind of finished goods and the buyer or the seller does not have to do anything to make the goods saleable. So they are already saleable in the condition that they are. So the buyer can receive them and the seller can sell them. So then the property passes when the contract is made, and it is immaterial whether the price has been postponed or the delivery of the goods has been postponed or both has been postponed. So now let us further try to examine the effect of this provision on actual contract of sale. So here there is an e-commerce contract regarding the sale of a book. The title of the book is An Uncertain Glory, India and Its Contradictions by John Derez and Amartya Sen. So the order details provided are the shipping address, the payment method, that is cash on delivery, the date when the order is placed, the estimated delivery, and total items that are left in the stock. So here what we find is that there is an unconditional contract related to specific goods. When the property passes, when the parties intend it to pass, the payment of price can be postponed. So here it is cash on delivery. So it means that when the contract is being made, at that point of time, the price is not being paid. It has to be paid on a later date, that is on March 28th. Then looking at the delivery of the goods, the order is being placed on March 22nd and the delivery is 6 days later. So here the delivery has been postponed, the payment of price has been postponed, but a contract has been made as soon as the order has been placed. Similarly, looking at some other transactions related to sale of goods. So for example, in auctions, the bids are placed on the goods. So one bid, then the subsequent bid of a higher quotation, there can be multiple bids. So as soon as the highest bid is placed, the hammer falls down and that the property has been sold. Although what has been quoted is only the price which the highest bidder is willing to pay. The actual price has not been paid. In the same way, the goods have also not been delivered. But as soon as the hammer falls and the highest bid is accepted, then it is like a contract has been made, although the price will be paid later on and the goods will also be delivered later on. Now let us take up another illustration. Here A contracts with B, so A is a buyer and B is the seller, a newspaper vendor, to provide him with daily newspaper for 1 month at the rate of rupees 3 per day. Now usually that happens in case of newspaper sale, that the payment is made at the end of every month. So here what we see is that the delivery is not postponed because every day the newspaper is being provided. However, payment is made only once, that is at the end of the month. So here only payment is postponed. So the property transfers or passes to the buyer, notwithstanding that the payment will be made at a later date. This is something that is explicit or can be brought out from the terms of the agreement as well as conduct of the parties. Now let us take a look at another situation that is provided under section 21, specific goods to be put in deliverable state. So when there is a contract for the sale of specific goods which are not in a deliverable state, and the seller has to do something in order to put them in a deliverable state, so they are not finished products as such, so they cannot be made a subject matter of contract of sale unless and until the seller does something that puts them in a deliverable state. So in that case, the property passes when such thing or obligation is done by the seller and buyer gets notice that such obligation has actually been done by the seller. So if these situations are fulfilled, then the property passes when the seller does any act which puts the goods in a deliverable state and buyer gets notice of the same. Now let us take up an exercise to help us understand this provision. There is a contract for sale of oil. The contents of oil have to be put into casks by the seller and then taken away by the buyer. Some of the casks are filled in the presence of the buyer, but before any are removed or the remainder is filled, fire destroys the whole of the oil. So the question here is, what is going to be the liability of the seller and the buyer with respect to those casks in which oil have been put and with respect to those which have been destroyed. So as per the provisions that we discussed, the goods have to be specific goods. So here what we find is that the casks, they are present before the seller and the buyer. So they have identified upon the particular casks that have to be filled with oil by the seller. So this is specific goods. The second is that they are not in a deliverable state because the seller has to do something to make them into a deliverable state. So now what is it that the seller has to do? He has to put the contents of oil into the cask. This is something that has to be done by the seller. So the property passes when the seller does such a thing, that is putting the oil into the casks, and buyer gets notice. So here what we find is that some of the casks are filled in the presence of the buyer. So the seller has done something that he was required to do to put them in a deliverable state, but not related to the remainder. So the buyer must bear the loss of the oil which had been put into the cask, because as soon as the seller put them in a deliverable state and the buyer got notice because he was physically present there, the property was transferred from the seller to the buyer. And with the transfer of property, the risk related to the goods also transferred from the seller to the buyer. But for the remainder of the goods, it is the seller who has to be responsible, because the property has not passed, because they are not in a deliverable state, because the seller was not able to put oil into the casks in front of the buyer. So the contract, if it is severable, then the property can pass related to portion of the goods and may not have passed related to the remainder of the goods. Now let us discuss another provision: specific goods to be put in deliverable state when seller has to ascertain the price. The provision is provided under section 22. Now, where there is a contract for the sale of specific goods in a deliverable state, meaning thereby nothing more has to be done, but the seller is bound to weigh, measure, test, or do some other act or thing with reference to the goods in order to ascertain the price of the goods. So, although the goods in themselves are deliverable, but the price has not been ascertained yet, then in this case the property passes when such weighing, measuring, testing, or any other action which is expected of the seller is done by the seller and the buyer has notice thereof. Now, to take an example of this provision, so we go to various grocery stores. Now, when we go to the grocery stores and if we pick up any commodity, any eatable like fruits or vegetables, so then the pricing of that fruits or vegetables has to be done after they are weighed or measured. So here the seller or the representative of the seller who is standing at the counter, he has to first measure or weigh them in order to ascertain their price. So as we see in this picture, the goods are in a deliverable state. They are a bunch of bananas. So there is nothing more to be done to the goods. But ascertainment of price remains. So as soon as the price is ascertained and the buyer has noticed that the price has been ascertained, it is like the goods have been apportioned to the contract and there has been a transfer of property. Then let us take up another provision, that is goods sent on approval or on sale or return basis. It is provided under section 24, which reads as: when goods are delivered to the buyer on approval or on sale or return basis, property passes to the buyer, part A, when he signifies his approval or acceptance. So this is the first ground. The second is when he does any other act adopting the transaction. So for example, if he sells it or if he keeps it as a security for any loan that he has taken. So it is like he has adopted the transaction. Second, if he does not signify his approval or acceptance to the seller, but retains the goods without giving notice of rejection, then if a time has been fixed for the return of the goods on the expiration of such time, if no time has been fixed, on the expiration of a reasonable time. Now, what is a reasonable time? This is something that depends upon the facts and circumstances of each case and the nature of the goods. So, if the nature of the goods is perishable in nature or they have to be consumed within a short span of time, the reasonable time is going to be lessened. Now let us take up some illustrations to further understand this section 24. So X delivers a watch to Y on sale or return basis. Y pledges the watch to a third party, that is Z. So the expression adopting the transaction that we discussed here. So adopting the transaction, as per this illustration, if you pledge the watch as a security, or if you give any third party rights without the approval of the seller, then it is like you have adopted the transaction, and instead of returning the goods, now it amounts to transfer of property and sale of goods. Then another example is X delivers a watch to Y on sale or return within 7 days. Y returns the watch on the 9th day. Now again, going back on section 24. So if time has been fixed for the return of the goods, then on the expiration of such time. So here in this case, what we find is that the time which was given was 7 days. However, for 7 days it was not returned. It was returned on the 9th day. So as soon as the 7th day expired, the property had transferred from X to Y. So with this, we close this lecture on passing of the property. We will continue with our discussion on other aspects of passing of property, especially related to passing of risk, in the subsequent lecture. Thank you very much.